Benjamin Castle are Americans. Watching the footy.
Liam Ryan saying, kick it my way, I want to jump over the pack, and here he comes! Ryan!
This is Buddy Franklin! This is the greatest showman!
Got the handball off to Myers. Myers looking for the lead of Stengel. Gee, they're good. Gee, they're sharp. Razzle dazzle Rioli.
Oh, who else? McDonald!
No,
around the body. Jazz up!
He's off from inside the centre square. Boys kick the goal. Boys kick the goal from inside the centre. Fuck! I can't believe it.
Good time of day, wherever you may be listening, whenever you may be listening. This is episode number 220 of Americans Watching the Footy. I'm Ethan Castle, coming to you from South San Francisco, California.
I'm Benjamin Castle, coming to you from San Diego, California. Earlier today, though, I was walking from Anaheim to Downey because I'm continuing my walk.
We're almost done with this thing.
Yeah, it's actually going to finish up by this coming weekend when I will get to the Chinese Theater in Hollywood and probably celebrate by going to college basketball that night. I'm relieved that it's going to be over with and that I've been able to do it somewhat officially, but it's a fun way to see Southern California, honestly. And speaking of Southern California, in just a bit, we're going to bring in someone else who's in Southern California. That's right, our first guest episode.
Took 220 episodes, and originally we were thinking he was just going to be like the second half of the episode, but then our conversation with him ended up going on pretty long and was really fun. So that's going to take up just about the entire episode. So instead of running through all of the news about, various injuries that have happened at training and stuff, I'm just going to give them to you in ultra high speed.
It's just like 50 states, a quarter of a second.
But real quick, if we get Matt Rowell, I will be fucking insufferable.
And Liam Ryan has been cleared. Sorry to hear that his partner was assaulted and that he also did get cleaned up in that fight. But looking forward to him being out there for the Indigenous All-Stars game. We'll definitely talk about that in the upcoming episodes. But this is going to be a pretty lengthy one because, for context, we are trying to get some of our friends to watch Australian rules football for the very first time and talk to us about it. We managed that with Ethan's friend Derek, and we gave him a high quality but not crazy ending game.
So this was inspired from the show Baseball Barbacast, and they introduced baseball to a Belgian guy who hosts a cycling podcast. So this isn't exactly like as much of a different world as that. Derek is dialed in with American sports, follows football and baseball pretty closely, is able to keep up with basketball and hockey as well. So it's not like he's totally unfamiliar with, say, the concept of team sports. But we will, in the description, include the link to the What is Baseball episode of Baseball Barbacast, because hearing a Belgian guy who knows nothing about American team sports try to explain baseball is hysterical. It's a mix of actual astute observations, like understanding, for example, the players in the field move around based on where they think the opponent's going to hit the ball, and also describing Felix Bautista's triple-digit fastball velocity as ooh la la. So inspired by that, we showed Derek a game, and we specifically showed him round 3 between Port Adelaide and Melbourne because good game, but not set his expectations unreasonably high. You'll see a game of this caliber just about every week. And I'm just going to hand things over to that because that's going to end up taking up pretty much all of this episode. And I think this was really fun. And if you have American friends that you can do this with, please do. It's a hilarious experience, and you'll get some great quotes out of it. So enjoy. We're about to make Americans Watching the Footy history with our very first guest. Only took us 3+ calendar years.
Yeah, because we started this show in, I think, late February or early March of 2022.
And part of our main goal when creating this was, we wanted to get more Americans interested in footy, and we wanted to introduce the game to more people, and we're kind of doing that now.
Yeah, finally. For a while, we just really got deeply into the analysis, but this is something we wanted to do for a hell of a long time, and the first person we've got to try this is one of Ethan's longest tenured friends.
Yeah, we're closing in on probably about 20-ish years. Something to that.
Man, has it been that long?
I mean, I think we probably went through what? BYBA and GATE, and that would have been what? 3rd, 4th-ish grade?
Yeah, that's right. It probably would have been both at around the same time. Because GATE, I think, was 04, 05.
Whenever you were entering 3rd grade then.
Yeah, so we're in the 20-year range. So yeah,
Wow.
He is Derek Daniels. He is joining us right now from, are you officially in Los Angeles? Or LA's like city demarcation stuff is very confusing.
I technically am in LA as a city. I have always put my mailing address as North Hollywood. Technically, I'm in the Toluca Lake neighborhood. It's more fun to not say LA because that's such a wide range of places, and sometimes, as with the case of the last couple weeks of fun early 2025 news, that can work against you because people will think you're in a completely different place than you're actually in. But yeah, I would say North Hollywood / Studio City is a good approximation.
And we can confirm you are not on fire and nothing particularly significant to you as an individual has burned, hopefully.
That is correct. You are correct, sir. I am okay. I have not caught on fire yet. My apartment is perfectly safe. I think the closest call we got, there was one tiny fire that sprouted up the first or second night of the Palisades fire that was like a one structure fire in Studio City. They ended up putting it out pretty quickly. And the common conspiracy theory that is going around is that particular one was insurance fraud. But, that is not been confirmed nor denied. But the fact that it was so contained when every other one was pretty widespread kind of let the cat out of the bag on that one. It's kind of crazy to, look at the aerial shots of Altadena and Pacific Palisades and Malibu and just think about the sheer scope of how much was affected by this. I don't know anyone that I've talked to between coworkers and friends and just sort of colleagues in the area who doesn't themselves know or themselves were someone who had to evacuate or lost their home in one of the two big fires. It's kind of crazy to think about how many people this affected. So obviously this is now, we're recording this on February 2nd. It's been almost a month, which is pretty crazy since the start of the wildfire windstorm ridiculous monstrosity. It's been a little wild, but I think everyone is starting to sort of, return to some sense of normalcy, which is good. We're starting to make jokes about it now, so that's good.
I guess you don't have to wait, 22.3 years.
Yeah, exactly. That I think probably we're a little bit closer than that. And you know what's funny in a morbid sort of way. So they had this big concert a few days ago called the Fire Aid, benefit relief concert. And it took place at both the Kia Forum and the Intuit Dome, and a ton of LA artists showed up. Also, it was Grammys weekend, so I'm sure that helped their cause. But Billy Crystal opened the show right after Green Day played the first three songs of the night. And he talked about how he opened the 9/11 concert for New York at Madison Square Garden in 2001, and how the vibes were very similar here, but also very different, because obviously in 2001 you're talking about a way bigger loss of life in a much more non-natural disaster way than this, which was a huge natural disaster with nowhere near as much loss of life. But the key difference was Billy Crystal mentioned he lost his home. He lived in the Palisades. He lived there for decades, and he was wearing the same clothes that he fled his house with, 3-4 weeks ago, and just talked about kind of that same but different feeling of these human beings who have had to, have lost almost everything. And it's just crazy to fathom. It's crazy to fathom. Anyway, that's my spiel about the fires. Donate if you can. I don't know the URL off the top of my head, but there's plenty of organizations looking for donations, and plenty of organizations, large and small, looking for volunteers, no matter what your qualifications. I know some have had to turn people away because there's so many people showing up to volunteer, which is amazing. And the outpouring of support from international borders has been absolutely amazing. So please keep it up, and please keep in mind that our planet is a finite resource and we need to help protect it. Sorry, that's my soapbox for tonight.
No, that was fine. That was fine. And the good news that I can report, all those fires, Eaton, Palisades, Hughes, are all 100% contained.
Yes, that was news, I think, as of, I want to say Thursday or Friday, which also in and of itself is crazy, because we've all lived in Northern California when they were getting big fires there.
A lot of that happened during my freshman year at Cal. They had to move big game the day before.
Yeah.
Bigger game, go Bears. And then down in LA that year too, there was all that smoke when Cal finally beat USC. Then during 2020, there was the Lightning Complex fire, which I think was the one that scared me the most.
The 2021 I remember was because we were all inside anyway because of the pandemic. I remember not even being able to go outside to take a walk because there was just this thick blanket of smoke over the Bay Area for weeks, like 2 weeks after the fire started. And finally we got to go outside, and I was just like, being able to breathe clean air again, I will never take it for granted.
Yeah, that was Orange Sky Day.
Yeah, right. Like September 2020, but clean air, good luck with that in LA.
Yeah, well, that's the other kind of thing too, is they've been talking about, how long stuff is staying in the air, what mitigates it, how long you should wear a mask outside. And at some point you do hit a threshold of, okay, well, the air in LA is only going to get so clean to begin with. At some point, you are just taking a risk of breathing unhealthy air sheerly by living here. But I think with this last batch of rain we got, that seemed to temper down a lot of the particle pollution. But yeah, and that is another thing to kind of morbidly chuckle at, is just the air quality here is never perfect. You never walk outside here and it's like wandering out into the redwoods or into Yellowstone where there's no one around for miles and miles and miles on either end. No light pollution and no ozone and that kind of stuff.
It's not China, but it's not great.
That is correct. And like I spent about a week and a half in South Korea. This is probably 2013. And the pollution there obviously was not great either. Not as bad as China. And it's just different. It's kind of crazy how some places just it doesn't stop. It's just this thick blanket of smog. And a lot of times it's just based on geography, the natural landscape of the surrounding areas. So, wild times.
So I guess the first thing to ask here, I mean, you are obviously familiar with American sports. I would say you're beyond literate. I'd say you're pretty tuned in, but what's before tonight, your exposure to footy other than, we watch it?
So you sent me that podcast episode from the baseball podcast, and I think the guy they talked to, his name was Benny, and I listened to the first hour of the hour and a half episode, and I could tell he had clearly watched or had experienced a small amount of baseball before he watched the game that they had sent him. It was a very, very minuscule amount. And I have to be dead ass honest with you guys. I wandered into this Australian rules football match, not knowing fucking anything about this sport, about how it was played, or really anything except that it was called footy, that you guys watched it, and it was big in Australia, and that the games were in the middle of the night. That is about as far as I got. And part of that was intentional, to kind of come into this with which as little knowledge as possible. And I remember writing down, I think it's something where it's not quite soccer, not quite rugby, and not quite American football. And I feel like that's a pretty reasonable encapsulation now, having watched a whole game of it. I feel like that's a pretty fair way to summarize the sport.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty appropriate.
I like your qualification of not quite rather than a mix of, because one thing we get a lot of when other people watch is just a mix of all these sorts of things. I think not quite is better off. I mean, I can't think of, obviously there's no other sport quite like it with a scoring mechanism. I mean, you can see it a little bit in rugby and place kicking in American football, but the only thing I can think of that's remotely comparable to it in an American sport is something like the fair catch kick that we saw the Chargers pull off, because that can be reminiscent of a mark and a set shot kick.
Right. Yeah, I definitely had, there's a lot of terminology that popped up in the broadcast that I just had no idea what they were talking about. But the scoring took me, I think, a full 3 quarters to figure out. And once I got to the 4th quarter, I think I had it mostly figured out. But basically, I want to see if I get this right. So you can either score 6 points or 1 point. And the 6-point score is for kicking a ball through the middle of the 3 uprights. And that can either be through the air, more like what you would see in a punt or a free kick in American football, or it can be kind of bouncing on the ground so long as it isn't touched on the way in. Does that sound more or less correct?
Yeah, that's very good. In between the taller of the 2 of the 4 uprights. Yes. And I hope you enjoyed the umpire's signals as well.
I did. Yeah, I recognize some of them. Obviously, the replay review is the same as VAR in soccer. But yeah, some of them I was like, wow, this is different. And then the 1 point score, that's 4 different things. So I would obviously a kick through the outer uprights, and then also anything off the post.
Off the inside 2 post, yes. If it's off the outside 2 post, it's no score whatsoever.
That's no score whatsoever. Okay. Yeah, there also was a moment, I think it was in the 1st quarter, which we'll go through the game, I think, a little bit later. But at some point, there was a penalty kick that was only worth a point. And then every other penalty kick, the rest of the match was a 6-point kick. So that was confusing to me. And I can't remember if the one penalty kick just went through one of the outer sets of uprights.
That had to have been what it was, like a free kick that missed the mark. You mentioned that these games were in the middle of the night. I had looked back. So this game was a 7 p.m. local game in Adelaide last March 30th. As a reminder, we showed Derek the Port Adelaide versus Melbourne game from round 3, a solid like B+ to A- tier game, I think. So yeah, that was 7 p.m. local time in Adelaide. So for us watching, that was 1:30 a.m. Pacific.
And I think that is probably going to be what keeps me from really seriously following the sport long term is just the sheer lateness of it. I think I enjoyed it for sure and would watch again, but not in the middle of the night. I think it just ends up being a little too late for me. And I got some good practice with it too. I think the last Women's World Cup or the one before was in Australia. And so it was very similar, timestamps on start times. And I just remember thinking, okay, I'm going to watch like 2 games of this tournament because it's way too late.
Yeah, it was the last one. That was actually going on during footy season. The nice thing is for anybody who's watching anywhere outside of Australia with the streaming platform Watch AFL, I mean, you get replays of games going back even 3 years, so you can watch it on your own time.
And there are games that start near the 7 to 8 p.m. range, so that's pretty nice. So I picked out this game in particular because it kind of fit the requirements that I was hoping for. A good game, but not like, iconic best game ever. Just like a conventional good game. On average, this past year, team scored 84 points a game, and the final score here was, I believe, 96 to 89. So it was like, you're going to get a game of sort of this caliber probably about once a week. At least 1 to 2 out of the 9 games played each week are going to be kind of this level. You're going to get competitive. This one was close the whole way. There are also a lot of blowouts. Didn't want to give you one of those. Wanted to keep you engaged, but didn't need to give you the game of the year because that just sets your expectations unreasonably high. And I think it also probably helped that both teams actually have the name of the city within their team name because there are a bunch of teams that are named for like neighborhoods within cities and stuff. And like remembering the first couple games I watched involving like Essendon against Fremantle, like half the time I was looking up like, wait, which team is from where? Whereas this, it's pretty clear. Port Adelaide is from Adelaide and Melbourne is from Melbourne. So that helps kind of simplify this.
Yeah, I also, with the research or lack thereof, didn't know really how many teams there were in the league.
There are 18 teams in the league. It's mostly centered around Melbourne, but there are teams now across the country. The regular season, the home and away season, as they call it, starts first or second week of March now. This year it's starting March 6th. And then the grand final is held on the last Saturday of September.
Okay.
So
it's their
home and away season or regular season is early to mid-March to end of August. And then September is finals.
Yeah, it's really a winter sport.
Yeah. So basically, as you might have been able to tell, the field, it's a cricket stadium, and those stadiums are used for cricket in the summer, and they're used for football in the winter. And then each team plays 23 games, and then the top 8 advance to finals. And the whole final structure is a really interesting thing that I don't need to confuse you with at this time, but there is much more incentive to be 1st through 4th than there is to be 5th through 8th.
Sure. That seems pretty similar to most playoff systems we have here, just in terms of who gets the home field advantage. I assume it is. There's probably no neutral site games until you get to, is the final in Melbourne?
The grand final is always in Melbourne. Now, there are a lot of stadiums shared by teams. Port Adelaide and Adelaide both play at the Adelaide Oval. Both teams share a stadium. Melbourne, there's basically 9 teams that play between 2 main stadiums. And then Geelong, my team, which is about an hour outside of Melbourne, that plays like 1 to 2 games a year in Melbourne as well. So they like half the league is in Melbourne.
That's pretty wild.
It's kind of a regional divide where like Sydney and Brisbane are much more rugby centric, whereas like most of the National Rugby League is in and around Sydney. And most of the AFL, which used to be just the Victorian Football League, is centered around Melbourne and in the state of Victoria.
So that was another question that I had, was whether this really was like a national sport or was focused more regionally. But definitely most Australian Football League teams are in the southern part of the country.
Mostly in Melbourne neighborhoods, actually exactly half are within Melbourne. But starting in the mid-'80s, they expanded nationally. Before that, the top league in each state just was really its own entity. And there's still a big thing about, Victorian bias, which permeates just absolutely everything about the league. It's like East Coast bias in American sports, but turned up to 12 here.
So like the SEC.
Yeah, kind of. Except most years the SEC deserves to be hailed as the best. This year was not one of those years.
Well, of course.
Basketball is loaded this year.
Right.
And actually, there's an SEC player who, if he doesn't make it to the NBA, he would play Australian rules football, but it's looking more and more likely that Alex Condon will play basketball.
Huh.
So I assume you also were wondering, like, how good are these teams?
That was also something I did ponder, yes. So from what I understand, in my brief amount of Wikipedia looking up during the match, it seems like Port Adelaide is very much the New York Yankees of the AFL.
Not quite. More like the San Jose Sharks.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. Port's story is interesting. You could consider them a dynasty, like in a Yankee sort of way, when it comes to their play within South Australia before they joined the AFL. So they're as old a club as a lot of the ones in Melbourne, but they only joined the AFL in 1997. Since then, they've won a single championship.
And within the last few years, basically, they've been really good at beating the teams they're supposed to beat, but then struggle against the other actually really good teams. Whereas Melbourne, they won the championship in 2021, had very high expectations the next couple of years, flamed out in the playoffs both times. And then this year, injuries and just not being very good really caught up to them and they really fell apart. But this game was a good early season win for them. And it was, I wanted to do an earlier season game so that like you didn't need all sorts of context coming in.
Oh, totally.
And yeah, I believe this was Melbourne's 4th game of the season and Port Adelaide's 3rd. So yeah, Port came into this game at
2-0.
and Melbourne came in 2-1. Yeah. And like at the time, we thought that both were going to be solid teams, and Port did end up meeting those expectations and Melbourne didn't. What other questions do you have? First off, did you notice anything about the size of the field or the number of players on the field or anything like that?
I think the first thing I noticed was definitely that the field was way too big. And that was kind of the first clue that told me it was a cricket ground. And then the second clue, obviously, is at one point they panned up to a scoreboard and it said like first innings and second innings. And I was like, oh, definitely this is cricket.
Two of the things that I think make the Adelaide Oval the coolest stadium are the giant manual scoreboard and the hill behind one of the goals.
That's right. I did see the hill.
The videos from there are awesome of just like, I get the impression that Adelaide fits like the stereotypes people have of Australia the most. Just like people chugging anything and everything on the hill, from beer to like bringing in your own gallon jug of chocolate milk and chugging it, because why not? Yeah, the Adelaide Oval is, I'm going to convert this from meters to yards for you. 182 and 2/3 yards by 134 and a half.
See, that to me just sounds exhausting. That is so much ground to cover.
So you probably also noticed that there were a lot of players on the field.
Yes. Is it like 15 aside?
18 plus 4 on the bench. And then you can bring players on and off 75 times for the game.
75?
Yeah, so it's not like soccer where once you're out, you're out. You can just bring guys on and off all you want.
It's like lacrosse with free substitution, but there's still a cap.
So you do have to manage your subs, and sometimes at the end of games, like if a team is burned up, a lot of their subs, they have to be strategic. You know, someone's out there. Like, imagine if hockey, there was a limit on the number of line changes you could make per game.
Right. It'd be tough for whomever's stuck out there last.
Yeah. Also, you might have seen at one point, like tactical substitution or something. So basically, each team gets to declare one player as a sub before the game outside of the main 22. They're a 23rd guy, and then you bring them into the game and take someone else out, and that is a permanent sub. And they're part of that 22, and 18 of those 22 are on the field at one time. But once per game, you get to take one guy totally out of your team and bring one guy in. And sometimes that happens because of injuries. Sometimes it's just, we want to go with a taller player or a faster player, or this guy's playing like shit.
Okay, so yeah, that was a follow-up question I had, was whether that would typically be saved for something like an injury, or whether you'd want to burn that a little bit earlier and try to adjust more based on strategy.
Yeah, so in this one, Port Adelaide sub was late in the third quarter, looking at our notes, and it was just, we want more speed. And Melbourne's was in the fourth quarter, little before the halfway point of the fourth, and it was just, this guy has done nothing all game. Let's bring on our fresh legs, where it's like, you save it in case of injury, and then at some point, if someone's not hurt, you pull the trigger. And then ironically, every now and then, right after you do that, of course, someone gets hurt.
Right.
Looking at our data this year, because we kept track of substitutions and how we categorize them, medical was the most common, but not by a ridiculous amount, I'd say. Statistically significant, but not too overwhelmingly ahead of tactical.
I mean, the sport is not it's not golf. It's in terms of its inherent safeness. The guys are running around with no protection, and also related to that, the shortest shorts and the tightest tank tops I have ever seen in a men's professional sport, which I got a big kick out of.
Just look up NBA highlights from the 70s and 80s. You'll see shorter shorts.
Oh my gosh. The shorts of the NBA now are probably, I would at least double, maybe triple the length of what Bill Walton was wearing when he led the Portland Trailblazers to the NBA title in 1976 or whatever that was. I mean, you go back and watch clips from then, it is a night and day difference.
So I wanted to ask you about the number of players on the field, because back in June, get back to the Airbnb during my friend's bachelor weekend, I turn on a game and I invite other people there to watch. And my friend's brother, his first observation is, there are a lot of motherfuckers on that field. I just wanted to see if you had a similar reaction.
I guess I was trying. It wasn't exactly that, but I did notice at some point, like, wow, there's a lot of people on the field, because I feel like for a lot of the broadcasts, they were covering it similarly to a soccer game, right? With very wide angle overhead kind of all field shots. It was difficult in some spots to kind of count how many guys were around. But also, I'll say this too, we talked about earlier how this sort of is an amalgamation of three sports that, at least in 4 years, will all be Olympic sports. The actual gameplay, to me is most similar to rugby, like 78% of the time, just in terms of the way the ball is lateraled, players are kind of running around. Seems like it's most similar to that the majority of the time. And obviously they kick the ball, downfield like they do in soccer. We've talked about the kicking, very similar to the punt in football. But the way they kind of scrum and tackle each other kind of seems most similar to rugby. And rugby, of the three sports, is the sport I'm familiar with the least because we just don't play it here in the US. It's just not as common. And so I feel like I need to watch rugby more to maybe garner more of an appreciation for footy. But at the same time, because it was very similar to rugby, it was really hard to kind of follow the action, at least to start. And so the number of players on the field didn't really cross my mind until, honestly, probably midway through the second quarter, when I was like, wow, there are a lot of guys on this field.
Yeah, and it's more than rugby because rugby union is 15 aside.
Right, yes. The Olympic one is less, isn't it? Isn't it?
It's sevens at the Olympics, yeah. And hopefully success in that from the U.S. women can spur on a growth of that. But that's another topic. I understand the similarities to rugby. Did you notice exactly how they were passing the ball to each other by hand?
It was a mix, which also confused me because that's different from rugby where you can only lateral or pass backwards. This very clearly was like a mix of laterals and passing backwards, and sometimes they would pass forwards, which just made very little sense to me. I wasn't really sure what, if anything, was considered an illegal move, and to that, which I had questions about kind of later on in the match, as more of the stoppages came up and more penalty kicks came up. I wasn't really sure what was considered a penalty-worthy infringement either. Obviously, there's some stuff that might be obvious, like, oh, you headbutted a player in the ribs when he was trying to catch a ball, and that's a penalty. Like, obviously, their broadcasts are not catering to the people who have never watched the sport before. But that was something I was confused on a lot, was what is considered an illegal move in the sport, both in terms of the movement of the ball and any sort of penalty that might be infringed.
Okay.
So there's a lot of area in that. First off, with passing, you can go forwards, backwards, etc., but you can't throw it. So when you thought they might have been lateraling, that's actually a handball, where basically you hold the ball in one hand and punch it with the other.
It's like an underhanded volleyball serve, I think is the best comparison.
Oh, wow.
And they can do that with some great speed and force, as you're able to see with the running passages in there.
The rules are really tough to pick up, and there's a lot of gray area and stuff that, over the course of the season, the league will overcorrect on in one direction or the other, but at least you do have, I think this is one of the best things for someone learning the sport. The umpires are always mic'd up. You can hear, they're saying high tackle.
Right. Yeah, there was a lot of terminology they were tossing around that was like an intercept. I picked up on that, but I wasn't sure also if that was a clock stoppage, because it seemed like also as I was watching it, the clock was stopping a lot. Whenever there was a possession change, obviously whenever the ball goes out of bounds, whenever there's a score. Are there any other times where the clock stops?
After certain free kicks, that's the term you'll hear, free kicks. After certain infractions that result in free kicks, the umpires will call for time off. That isn't completely set in stone, but it's usually like if the infringed player doesn't have the ball and needs to get it back. Once they get it back, you'll hear time back on, and they'll go from there.
Okay.
Appreciate this. So on the broadcast, you see the clock counting down from 20 minutes, right?
Right.
In the stadium, the clock counts up and just goes continually. So, like, you don't know exactly if you're in the stadium, like, when the siren to end the quarter is going to sound. Now, on the bench, they have that, but, like, on the field, you can just see, like, the time going up. So you'll have, teams communicate from the bench, like, to let you know you have 1 minute or something.
Huh.
It also leads to great crowd reactions at the end of tight games. You might have seen it a little bit from this one, but imagine like home fan reactions to a 1-point win.
It's kind of like, the crowd reaction when the referee blows the whistle at the end of a soccer game. So
I think it's almost more immediate though, because sometimes it's hard to hear the whistle at first. Here everybody hears a siren at the same time.
Also, if you were confused about, like, why did this guy get to kick after the clock was at 0? I'm not sure if that even happened in this game, but basically, if you get a free kick, you get 30 seconds to take it. So if you get awarded a kick when the clock's at 10 seconds, those final 10 seconds tick off, the siren goes, and then you still have another 20 seconds to take the free kick. So that's where you can have the equivalent of a buzzer beater and after the siren goal.
Right. I think that did happen maybe even twice in this game.
Yeah, it looks like at the end of the third quarter and at the end of the first quarter. Yeah, Charlie Dixon absolutely mossed Tom McDonald and then kicked the goal. And then end of the third quarter, Max Gaughan kicks one from outside of the 50-meter arc. So yeah, that actually happened twice in this game. So I'm glad you saw that. So you can get how, like, if a guy's lining up to take a shot and say his team is down 4 points at the very end of a game, that's, buzzer beater in the NBA Finals type moment.
And from a practical standpoint, similar in some respects to like an untimed down at the end of a half in American football. I say there's a penalty that's been infringed and they ran it off, but there's one that they give the other team one more shot with no game clock to put something together.
Yeah, think of like an after the siren goal, which did happen once in 2024, late in the year, as like the equivalent of a Motown miracle. That Packers Hail Mary in Detroit a few years back.
Right. Oh man, yeah. For Detroit, they just can't catch a break.
Benjamin, 78% of our listeners are between 18 and 35 years old, so they probably want to start a podcast like we did. How did you know that number, Ethan? Thanks to the analytics we have for Spotify for Podcasters. Formerly known as Anchor, sorry Frio fans, Spotify for Podcasters has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your phone or your computer. No fancy software needed. It's so easy you can edit it while drunk. And Spotify for Podcasters doesn't just allow you to upload to Spotify, you can also distribute your podcast on platforms like Apple, Stitcher, and more, just like we do. Best of all, it's completely free. Not only is it free, you can even make money from listener support or ad revenue. Hint, hint. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to podcasters.spotify.com to get started today.
And welcome back to episode 220. Thank you so much for joining us. A reminder, you can find us on a variety of social media platforms at Americans Footy, where the conversation can continue and then some. Individually, I'm on Twitter at BenjaminHK01.
I'm at Castle Media. Brian Harambe is on Instagram at CatNameDBrian.
I saw he has been very affectionate as of late. I miss him.
I'll put up photos of him or something at some point. Anyway, so let's just keep running through your list of questions, I guess.
Okay, so I think we kind of covered this a little bit. Is this sport played anywhere outside of Australia? Probably a no.
Yes, but not exactly professionally.
The AFL is the highest league in Australia and thus the world. There are the state level leagues, but outside it's a lot more semi-pro or even straight up amateur. There's an amateur league here in the States, the USAFL. They play in a lot of park spaces or like converted soccer or football fields, and they often play that 9-a-side as opposed to 18. And there's actually There are a number of teams actually here in California. There's the San Diego Lions, the LA Dragons, and the Golden Gate Club as well up in San Francisco. And they have a national tournament every year. And actually, a few years back, it was in Ontario, not too far away from us now. But there's no other like real professional scene like this.
Okay, gotcha. That's kind of what I figured. And would you say this is, I know we talked about sort of the regionality of what is popular where. Would you say in general, this is the most popular sport in Australia, or would it be something else like soccer or cricket or rugby?
In terms of winter sports, it's a battle between Australian rules football and rugby league. And that's kind of at the state level with what we talked about earlier with Queensland and New South Wales. Summer sport is definitely dominated by cricket, and I've been into that this summer more than ever. But in terms like some of the highest ratings and stuff that you get, it's either the AFL Grand Final or a huge Australian soccer match.
Or I will also throw in the state of origin rugby games, which are basically New South Wales versus Queensland, basically all-star teams.
Okay.
But in terms of like professional sport, I would say this is definitely the biggest and longest tenured successful like professional league. And pretty lousy job of exporting it to the rest of the world.
Yeah, this league has actually been around since 1897.
I mean, I think at some point, if you have, and we run into this problem with American sports as well, you know, whether it's American football that just hasn't taken on around the world, baseball, which, you know, has taken on in some countries, but maybe not as many as we would like. At some point, when you slap a country's name at the front of the sport, I think that makes it more difficult to latch on in other countries outside of its point of origin. And I don't think, you know, Australian rules football and something like baseball or American football are alone in that. I'm sure there are other countries that have sports that just, for whatever reason, just have not taken off anywhere else. And I'm kind of curious now, actually, to think about what those might be and try to like find some of those.
Kabaddi. Kabaddi's only big in South Asia. It's like Red Rover and tag kind of.
It's funny though that you talk about the reach of American football in that respect, because it sounds like there's going to be an announcement about bringing an NFL game to Melbourne in 2026.
Right. Yeah. They talked about that. And I know they've talked about putting the Super Bowl in London, but logistically, that would be a nightmare.
I don't think that would ever happen. It would almost, to me, that would almost feel like selling a game to the Saudis, like some of the European soccer leagues do.
Sure.
But yeah, in terms of international reach of footy, I mean, it has felt like this past decade there was a great opportunity for it in America because there is an American currently playing in the AFL.
Oh, no way.
Yes, his name is Mason Cox. He is 6'10", I believe, the joint tallest player ever in the league. He played college basketball at Oklahoma State, and he won the championship in 2023 with Collingwood, another one of the Melbourne teams.
Wow. Good for him. That's amazing. Think about how amazing that is. Oh, it's ridiculous.
That he basically got taken halfway across the world to play a sport he hadn't heard of.
And in less than a decade, won a championship at the highest level for one of the most storied teams. That's something you can export, and yet done such a shitty job of that. I mean, you'll get games broadcast on Fox Sports 1 occasionally, Fox Sports 2 more often, but just the coverage hasn't been there. There hasn't been enough of that sort of cross-cultural exchange. Meanwhile, we're getting the sort of reverse of it now with Australians punting in college football in the NFL, and they are doing the publicity the right way. I mean, both the punters in the national championship game between Notre Dame and Ohio State were Australian.
Oh, I actually didn't know that. That's hilarious.
The Ohio State punter, actually, his dad is like a big media personality in Australia.
No way. Oh, what a Nepo baby. Unbelievable.
Oh, like Nepo babies, this is the sport for you. So, like, there are a few family names that are really famous here, and the league actually has a rule that I think is kind of interesting called the father-son rule, where basically, like, if your dad played 100 games for a team, they have priority to draft you. Yeah, and so, yeah, basically play for a team for usually, 5-6 seasons or more.
I mean, I love that. Like, that is cool, but also imagine that happening here. Do you know what I mean? Like, the Niners getting top priority to draft Jerry Rice's son, or, I forget where Ken Griffey Sr. was when in Junior first, like, entered the league. But imagine that team, like, getting first priority to draft Ken Griffey Jr.
If the Reds had right of first refusal, it's like right of first refusal with like some draft pick trades involved, and it does definitely favor the Victorian teams, the more storied teams in that regard.
Sure.
There were players, I think, on each team in this game, both for Port and for Melbourne, that were drafted through the father-son rule for those teams.
That is crazy. That is crazy.
To like how you accrue the draft capital to be able to trade to use that father-son slot in the whole bidding system. But yes, that is the thing. This is the Nepo baby sport.
Wow. That is mind-blowing. I am learning more and more every minute.
I just looked at the list for this game, and there were 2 players on each team whose fathers also played for them and who qualified under that draft rule. And actually, one of them was the sub for each team.
Oh, for fuck's sake. That's ridiculous.
Oh, like arguably the face of the sport right now, playing on the most famous and most hated team, falls under that as well.
As does his older brother.
What is the most famous and most hated team in the AFL?
That would be Collingwood, the one that the American plays for.
Think like elements of the Yankees, Raiders, and Philadelphia Eagles, except flip around the Yankees World Series record, and like their history is they always lose the World Series instead.
Oh, so they're they're the Dodgers before the Dodgers started winning a lot in the 80s.
Kind of, yeah.
At some point, it flipped from Yankees dynasty-like to more Dodger-like. They were tied for the most championships, but all but 3 of them were before our parents were born.
Yeah, man. Gosh, those Yankees. Okay, Collingwood is the name of the evil team.
One, honestly, we don't have as much of a gripe with them as we do with their rivals, Carlton. And I honestly think that that's a lot. That part of it is because the American is on Collingwood.
And also just, I perceive Carlton as like snotty, elitist, like Toronto Maple Leafs, Michigan were classy type people.
Collingwood's definitely like traditionally like the working class Catholic fans.
They are definitely fans have the fewest teeth, although Port Adelaide is known for having fans with bad teeth too. And Richmond.
Well, it's a British colony, so we can't be, super surprised.
Yeah. And I'll note, like, Port Adelaide draws from a pretty wide group of fans within the immediate Adelaide area. Meanwhile, Melbourne is much more of an upper class team.
Okay.
There are jokes that once the first snow hits the mountains, their attendance goes down because all their fans go off to the ski resorts.
That's hilarious. I love that.
Meanwhile, Port, they try to pattern themselves after Liverpool, honestly, because you know how Liverpool has "You'll Never Walk Alone" before games?
Yes.
Port Adelaide does "Never Tear Us Apart" by In Excess.
So this actually does lead me into my first question, which was about, Ethan, the ritual that you had sent me. What is this? The broadcasters clearly were hinting at some kind of history between the club and this song. What is the history with the team and that song?
So for reference, I just sent Derek a video, but I think it was from 2021 Showdown. But yeah, it kind of became a thing. They wanted to pattern something after Liverpool, and they wanted to look for a song that was culturally relevant enough in Australia. And INXS were definitely that. But also, when Port joined the AFL, kind of promoting themselves from the South Australian League, that definitely caused a rift in their fan base that took a good bit to mend those first several years. And really around the time they won their first championship in '04 was finally when everyone kind of coalesced around the Port Adelaide AFL brand. So that's what ties into that. And I love the tradition because it doesn't feel like ridiculously in your face like Liverpool. And it's also just a good fucking song.
You know, it's funny because as they were singing it, I was like, wow, whoa, weird fucking choice for like a pregame ritual. Like Sweet Caroline, you know, you can kind of see it, you know, great song that a lot of people know, or like Bohemian Rhapsody, again, a song that a lot of people know. I feel like if you went around and played Never Tear Us Apart in most bars in the United States, you'd get like, oh, yeah, it's that song. But clearly in Australia, it has a way bigger following.
Yeah, kind of like INXS were an Australian group. I mean, this hit, it actually charted higher in the US than it did in Australia. It's just, you know, the band had a lot more staying power in their home country. Like, I don't think many Americans would think of INXS outside of like Need You Tonight and Don't Change, maybe?
Oh, I didn't realize they did Need You Tonight also. That's a banger.
Actually, that's off that exact same album.
What?
Yeah, Need You Tonight, New Sensation, and Never Tear Us Apart were all from that one album from '87.
They did New Sensation also?
And Kick.
Oh my God. This is my new favorite band.
All right, so maybe Derek's going to be a Port Adelaide fan. Cool.
This is ridiculous. Oh my gosh. Look at that. That is wild.
Yeah, they sing the second verse before every Port Adelaide home game.
Okay. And then, so Port Adelaide and Melbourne is probably not considered the biggest rivalry in the AFL.
Not. That's either.
This was kind of just, you know, I picked out just like, you know, a pretty ordinary game between two teams that don't have like tons of shared history.
Yeah, like the big rivalries, honestly, Port Adelaide and Adelaide, the in South Australia rivalry called the Showdown, we consider that to be the best of them, along with Carlton and Collingwood.
Like everyone considers Collingwood a rival. Like Essendon Collingwood is also big.
I was looking it up though. Yeah, these teams don't really have any history with each other. It had been dominated by the home team for a while, and that kind of flipped starting in the 2010s. But these teams have never met in a playoff game, a final against each other. Yeah, so we just picked this because it was a run-of-the-mill matchup that ended up being a pretty decent game.
You know, if someone had never seen an NFL game and I wanted to show them, you know, you don't want to show them like greatest game of all time. You get them like, I don't know, say this would be a matchup between, I'm trying to think, it was just like a couple of good NFL teams that don't face off all the time. I don't know, an Eagles versus Texans game that ended up like, you know, 31-28 or 28-24.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, that was everything I had from the pregame ritual. So then I sat down and I started the game, and all it said on the scoreboard was first. And I had no idea if that was half or quarter or period. And I just sort of was guessing. And obviously it as it came to pass, that was first quarter. But these are long quarters. I mean, 20 minutes for a quarter with as many stoppages as they have. And even with no ads and no pre or post game coverage, it still came out to 2 hours and 15 minutes of just game action time.
Yeah, so the average game ends up, like the average broadcast is, say, in the 2 hour 40 to 2 hour 45 minute range. So this was condensed. You don't get any of the pregame stuff. This might knock out one of your questions, but after the first quarter and after the third quarter, there is a 6-minute break, and then halftime is 20 minutes.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, I wasn't sure if the quarters had any sort of significant break, because obviously in most American sports, when they do the quarter breaks, it's like half a second, like enough time to switch sides of the floor, and that's pretty much it. So the opening tip-off, I'm literally just going in the order of my notes here. The first note I had, which we already talked about, was you kick the ball through the upright and get 6 points? What the fuck? And then the second one I had was that the ref bounces the opening tip-off as opposed to doing a throw in the air or a roll on the ground. It's like, it was like he was angry at a textbook and smashed it on the ground, and then it bounced in the air, and then the game started.
That is an outstanding description. I already feel so right for having you on as the guest for this. But yes, it is literally called the opening bounce.
Wow. That's amazing.
When it rains, usually they just throw the ball up in the air instead, which is a shame.
Okay.
But yes, that you did get to see. That is how games start.
In fact, that's how it almost always happens in good weather after a goal or at the start of each period of play. And sometimes the umpire fucks up, and when he does, then he throws it up.
Okay. Cool. And then at that point, I think I started looking more at the wide angles of the field and saw the name Footy and thought, where did this name come from?
Good question, honestly. I think of it as just standard Australian slang, but you hear footy to describe football, as in soccer, in the UK and other places as well. So I don't know. I was never really thinking about that, honestly, in my 5+ seasons now of watching this sport. We just kind of took it as a fact of footy.
I love it. I'm all here for it. Okay. And then I wrote, wow, these tank tops are tight, which we did already cover that. 1 point for a doink. We covered that. This one sounds super stupid. Okay, Melbourne just kicked another 6-pointer.
Yes, that's a goal. So 6 points. 1 point is a behind because, it goes through the behind post. If you're looking at it from the side, it goes behind the main goalposts.
Are those 2 posts on either side technically behind the main goalpost?
I mean, if you're looking at it from the side, but they're all along the end line.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just a behind that in the sense that if you kick a 1-pointer, I guess, the kick would go behind the regular goalposts.
Okay, gotcha.
So now you know what a goal and a behind are. Very good.
I figured out that you can only score 6 or 1 points. You cannot score 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5, and 7 is way too much.
It sounds like the explanation of how to count to 3 when throwing the holy hand grenade.
Exactly.
Counting to 5 is strictly forbidden.
Strictly forbidden.
And you said it took you until like the end of the third quarter or so to actually figure out what the scoreboard meant in terms of showing the goals, behinds, and total points.
I guess I figured out because they had the 3 columns, and the first column I just knew was showing how many times someone scored 6, and the second one was how many times someone scored 1, and the third was the total points. But I guess it took me a while to figure out what kick in what spot gave you how many points, because you could, I mean, people were making goals from all over the place. There was one guy who made it from basically the end line and curved it around like almost 180 degrees into the middle goalpost. And at that point I was like, okay, This is just ridiculous.
Yes, that's called kicking a snap. And let's see, that definitely happened at some point in this game.
I mean, there were a handful of good snaps.
Yeah, look at our notes from almost a full year ago. Yeah, there were a bunch of those.
Oh, I found it. Okay, I found it in my notes. It was at the end of the first quarter. I wrote, badass 6-point curvy goal for Port Adelaide.
Ooh, that might have been the after the first quarter siren by Charlie.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah. So he was one of the players that I liked very quickly. He just retired, actually. But
Oh, no way.
I mean, he played 14 years. And, a lot of guys retire once they hit their early 30s in that sport because you're playing, at the top level from age 18 if you're good enough.
Oh, wow. That is, man. I mean, I guess that makes sense for a sport that clearly has a very niche regional following. Like you could ascend pretty quickly.
And there's I just think of it like soccer in that respect, kind of where people can play that young. I mean, there's no sort of NCAA equivalent in Australia.
Right. Of course. Okay. There was something else that happened in the first quarter called a touch kick.
Oh, yes. Yeah, a kick was touched, and so they couldn't catch it cleanly for a free kick. So you probably heard the umpire say, touch, play on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
This is a good time to explain the mark rule. So probably easily the cause of the most whistles in Australian rules football is a successful mark. That's when a player kicks a ball at least 15 meters and someone cleanly catches it without anyone else touching it. That's called a mark, and the player then gets a free kick from that spot. And you'll hear a whistle after every mark.
Oh, okay. That explains why there were so many whistles.
Which is probably one of your first observations.
Yeah, it was a lot of whistles and a lot of stoppages. And I clearly not all of it was happening after what would be considered an infraction of any kind. But man, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, there were, looking at it, 142 total marks in that game.
That is so many marks.
That's honestly not a crazy amount.
That's crazy. I think that's crazy. Even if that's not a crazy amount, I think that is like, God, I couldn't imagine like sitting there. But this is the other thing too that I noticed is even with all of those whistles and stoppages, the game still flows very quickly.
Yes, which is part of what makes it fun.
I think of the flow of the game as being closer, honestly, to hockey than rugby.
Okay, I could see that.
And rugby league especially, there's more stop and go, but rugby union, it can often take a while for the ball to move with just a lot of tackles in really, really quick succession. I mean, you saw how quickly some players were able to kick or even run and bounce down the field. I assume you saw some bounces.
Yes, lots of bounces. They were bouncing, flouncing all over the place. Yeah.
So if you run with the ball for 15 meters, you have to bounce it in order to keep running.
Oh, okay. Otherwise, it's like a travel.
Yes. And you'll
Actually, like very similar to the signal for traveling.
you actually hear the umpire saying too far.
Stop! You've gone too far.
I'm not sure if it happened in this game, but it happened a couple prominent times during the season. You see it like, I don't know, at least every other round.
Huh. You'd think people would learn where 15 meters was.
Yeah, but the only real markings for distance on the field and the size of the field can vary based on the size of just the cricket grounds themselves, like how soccer pitch sizes can vary. But the only marking really is just 50 meters out from the goals. That mark.
Right. And then this one also, there was a big square in the middle of the field. Was that for cricket or was that anything to do with this?
It has to do with this. Basically, when you have a center bounce, each team has to have like 6 guys in that big square, 6 guys in their defensive 50 inside that big arc, and 6 guys in the forward 50. Because it used to be teams could just flood everyone to one side and then, say you're up by 1 goal with a minute left, you just throw everyone in defensively and there's really hardly any chance of scoring.
You can do that still during free play, but not, right after a goal. And then also there's that circle right in the middle that you probably saw. That's where the two players compete for the bounce or throw. Those players are called rucks, and those are the tall guys.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was a pretty consistent feature, was that initial face-off.
Very reminiscent of a basketball tip-off.
Yeah, except if they bounced the basketball for no reason other than they felt so inclined to do so. Okay, so at some point, the score got up to 18-1, and I genuinely was not sure if that was considered a large deficit or not. Clearly it wasn't, because Melbourne came all the way back and ended up winning the game. But what would you consider? I mean, what is an irreversible comeback? Like, what is the point of no return in this sport? Like, you cannot come back from more than this many points down.
To quote Mean Girls, the limit does not exist.
The limit does not exist.
Because this is an incredibly streaky sport. I mean, there are no timeouts other than, the quarter and half breaks. So teams could just go on ridiculous runs. 18-1, that's within 3 goals. That's nothing crazy at all. I mean, it really depends on the flow of the game. You can have some pretty low scoring games. I mean, there's one of the games in the Final Four last year, in 2023 rather, was like 58-57.
Games in the ring can be very ugly and low scoring.
Oh yeah, there was a 43-42 game where just nobody could kick straight or handle the ball properly a couple years back.
And then you'll also have a good chunk of games where teams both get into the triple digits. But I think the largest comeback last year, something around 54 or so?
That Collingwood North comeback, it was 54. And the largest comeback ever in the league's history is by a very nice 69 points.
Nice.
Yeah, biggest comeback. Yeah, that was back in 2001. Back when teams scored at even higher rates. It used to be possible to kick 100 goals in a season. And for an individual to do that.
Oh my God. Because that's what, probably 4 or 5 goals a game?
Yeah, so the leader this year actually scored
69 in the regular season.
The year before was 78, but over the last few years, usually somewhere in the 60s-ish. So in the vicinity of 3 a game.
Okay, the last one that came up during the first quarter is sort of as it pertains to the out of bounds line that runs around the field, because there were some people who were running out of bounds with the ball and then immediately they got to throw it back in. So what is the rule on that? It's sort of perimeter line. Are they taking the ball out and throwing it back in? At what point does it become a dead ball? Is there a possession change? That kind of stuff.
Hey, firstly, I hear a smoke detector in the background.
Yeah, it's not mine.
It's not mine either.
It's somebody else in this building, and it's been going off all day, and it's awful.
Just want to make sure you are all right.
Oh yeah, I'm good. It's God. Yeah, I think even I shut the windows and it's still going.
So in terms of out of bounds, basically whenever the ball goes out of bounds, there's a stoppage, and usually it's thrown in. But if it's kicked out of bounds directly on the fly, or as the terminology is, on the full, then it's a turnover.
Did you get to see the umpire throw the ball back into the players at any point?
I think so.
Did you get to see the umpire throw the ball over his own head and just yeet it?
That I can't remember.
Probably, yeah. Sometimes they go close up on the rucks in that case, but yeah, when it's a boundary throw, they throw it back in. The umpire just yeets the ball over their head.
So yes, out of bounds doesn't always just go to whichever team didn't touch it last, unless you just basically kick it out of bounds deliberately or have a really bad kick. A lot of times if the ball just deflects out of bounds, they just throw it back in, and then the ruckman fight over it.
Gotcha. I moved to another room. Hopefully the smoke detector is a little bit less obnoxious.
Hear a little of it, but it's not as bad.
Okay, cool. Well, you can tell them there's no fire. Everything's fine here. And I'm going to go yell at someone.
And then while Derek goes and yells at whoever smoke detector that is that's still going off, I think it's time for us to step aside here and call this an episode.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, but we're going to have to cut this off so that we don't have, like a 2.5 hour episode. But don't worry, we will be back with part 2 of introducing someone to footy.
And that'll just be in a couple days' time. So the conversation for now can continue at Americans Footy on Twitter and on Instagram as well. Maybe on YouTube. I mean, we do have a comment section. We have the videos of these posted there as well. So hello to any YouTube listeners.
Can we put some Subway Surfers gameplay in this?
I'll think about it.
I really hope the suggested videos are all if people watch this on YouTube, I hope the suggested videos are all like Fortnite funnies and Family Guy funnies and beautiful moments of respect in sport. You can find me on Twitter at Castle Media.
You can find me at BenjaminHK01 and find Ethan's feline son at Cat Named Brian on Instagram.